everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Helen and this is Stitch Rip Repeat, and today's video is kind of a follow-on to my top tips video that I did a couple of videos back. Thank you so much to everybody who watched and commented on that and my most recent video. I had a thought after doing the top tips and getting some comments that I could do a follow-up video, and this video is going to be a quick introduction to what I would personally do when I'm starting out on my pattern. So it's kind of a follow on to the top tips for beginners, because I had a few comments from the lovely Anna and Lynn on my top tips videos about things that they do that I hadn't really mentioned when it came to patterns. So I'm doing just a quick one today to show what you do when you've read the packet on your pattern and you want to actually open and get started. Again, this is just some ideas that I've come up with along the way with my sewing journey, and lovely things that Lynn and Anna reminded me of, so thank you ever so much, ladies. It is so true. The couple of things that they mentioned are things that I also do, so they must be a good tip, I think, for anyone starting out. So I'll show you the video now. It's really just to do an introduction to patterns and reading them, and then I think what I'll do in a future video is I'll do the sort of follow on from where I leave this off. So I'm going to leave this off with having hopefully opened the pattern, read instructions, traced off and got everything ready and be comfortable that they can start. And then I'll do another video, a follow-up video at some point, doing what we do with the pattern and the pattern pieces once we've got to that point, so we can actually sew. So I hope you enjoy my little look over patterns. I will be using two patterns for this video because I thought that the Big Four and the Indie are slightly different. So please enjoy the video and I'll see you at the end of the video. Okay, so as I said in the intro, I'm going to be showing today the two basic patterns that you will be dealing with if you are sewing. And that would be a packet from an independent company, which we call the Indie patterns, such as this one here by Tilly and the Buttons, and what I know as the Big Four, although I think there's more than four, and that would be the more traditional patterns like McCall's, Simplicity, Vogue, New Look, etc. We're going to go through the McCall's pattern first, so I'm just going to pop this Tilly one to one side for now. And as I said in my previous video for tips, a good tip obviously is making sure that you've read everything you need to before you get started on the back of the pack. And there was a couple of things that I didn't actually remember to point out, and that would be if, for instance, it's a knit pattern like this one, quite often they have this handy little tool here because you need a certain amount of stretch in your knits to make different patterns. Now this one here is showing that you need to have, if you've got this amount of fabric, then you need to be able to stretch it to the end of the arrow, and then you know it will work for this pattern. So that's a really handy little tool they put on the packets. And as we said before, just make sure that before you even start the pattern, you've got everything you need and you are good to go. So once you open your pattern, two things inside every pattern will be your instructions and your pattern pieces. Now this brown thin paper is the more traditional type of pattern that the Big Four will use, and so that's why I'm going to go through this one separately, because you'll see in a bit that the Indies tend to use paper patterns. We're just going to pop the pieces to one side for now. Inside the instructions, it will have everything you need to know for that pattern, and I think it was the lovely Lynn that pointed this out on my previous video. Is a good tip is to read through your pattern before you start, and what you'll find is you will have the pattern markings, so anything that's on the pattern will be shown in your instructions. So it shows things like your grain line, place on fold, buttonholes, etc. So they're always on your pattern pieces to refer to. It will give you tips on things like cutting and marking your pattern. Very good, especially if you're new. Then it will also have your cut and layouts based on the fabric you have. So if your pattern piece for A and you're using 150 centimetre wide fabric, then it's recommended the layout for you there. And again, if you're doing pattern version B, it will recommend a different layout. Now these are really good guides, but if you want to save fabric, or if you haven't quite got the right amount of fabric, or you've got directional fabric, you will have to do a little bit of what we call Tetris with your pattern pieces to make sure that you can get all those pieces off the fabric that you have. But a great starting point is in the layout they have inside. So they have a layout for all the patterns, and on this page they'll also have for each pattern that you're making. So this one actually has A, B, C, D, E. Sorry about that. 5 different styles of the pattern. So you will know that if you are making C on the front here, inside your instructions it will say all the pieces that you need for C. So on here it tells you actually that you need all the pieces for your front, back and side back, for all of them. But the pattern sleeve for C would actually be number 6. You don't need number 5 because that's the pattern marking for sleeves for A and E. So what I tend to do is I tend to circle or highlight the pattern pieces that I need, or even just jot down which numbers you need before you look at the pattern, because then you know that at the end of it, as long as you've got the ones that you've circled or written down or highlighted, you've got all the pieces you need for the pattern you're cutting out. So general information about pattern markings cutting, your layout and your pattern pieces will all be laid out for you on this piece of paper inside your pattern. Then on the other side and on the other pieces is where you usually will see the actual instructions. So it says quite clearly sewing directions on this piece of paper, and it also gives you a key for the fabric, so shows you which the illustration is the right side, which is the wrong side, and which is interfacing, etc. Always tells you what seam allowance to work with. Here it says a 5/8 inch or a 1.5 centimetre, and then it gives you a general glossary of stitches. Now these were really good for me starting out because I'd never done any of these stitches. So things like top stitch, stay stitch, edge stitch, didn't really know what they meant. They do give a good example, sorry, a good explanation in here. So it would say on your edge stitch to stitch close to the finished edge or seam. It also says things like top stitch on the outside, 1/4 inch from the edge, etc. But I would say if you're at all confused or worried about these, as I said in my previous tips, have a look on YouTube, because there's always examples and you can actually see someone doing these stitches. If, for instance, if you look up top stitching, there will be lots and lots of videos you can follow. And if you find that easier than understanding these instructions, then by all means go ahead. And then it has each step, 1, 2, 3, right through to the finished garment. And again, as I said, if you're not sure what the instructions mean, as I said in my previous video, and I say all the time, you can Google it, you can YouTube, you can ask other sewers. Don't ever panic and think, I can't do this. It's usually more straightforward than it appears. I find with the older patterns that some of them are a bit vague in the instructions compared to indies, so I would always ask if I wasn't sure. So with your instructions all ready for you, comes to patterns, and I think again it was probably Anna or Lynn, one of those lovely ladies, that mentioned their tips when it comes to the pattern pieces. So they'll all be folded like this, and this paper is quite thin. It reminds me of a sort of tissue paper rather than paper. Great tip to begin with, and I would highly recommend it. Iron your pieces out before you cut them out. And top tip from me, and ask me how I know, test the heat of your iron on a piece that's not important first, because obviously you're going to need it quite a low heat. Don't go whacking it up to the top of your settings and then wonder why your pattern's melted on your iron. So test a little bit until you get the creases out without making any scorching or damage to your pattern, and then lay out the pieces and give them a good iron. because all these little creases here can actually affect how your piece turns out when you cut it out. So you want a nice flat piece ready for cutting out. Then when you are ready to cut out, this is where those markings that they mentioned in your instructions will be. So, for instance, the little triangles, and if you can see, hopefully you can, the little triangles that you'll see on these patterns are where they want you to notch the fabric. And this is really, really important. Again, ask me how I know. Always mark your notches. Now, some people will mark them in with the triangle and some people mark them out. Really doesn't matter how you do it. You can do it with a snip, you can mark it in, mark it out, as long as they are marked on your pattern so you can transfer that to your fabric. So another important thing that you'll need to be aware of, and it's not all the patterns, but I came across this and came unstuck when I first started out, is that some of the patterns will actually be 2 sizes. So some of them have 2 sizes as literally separate patterns, so you would need to buy the right size pattern. But in this case, this one is a size 6 to 22 included. But what they've done is they've made them separate pieces. So this piece here is only for sizes 14 to 22. And then you'll see other pieces, like this one here, which is the sizes 6 up to 14. So with your list that you made of the pieces you need to cut out, just make sure that when you're cutting out, say you need number 4, that you're cutting out 6 to 14 if that's the one you need, or you're cutting out 14 to 22 if you need the larger size. So take your time, find the correct size pieces, mark them off your list. And then, as I say, I tend to trace. So I would get my tracing paper out and trace. But if you want to go straight ahead and you're happy to cut your pattern, then obviously you're going to cut the line you need for your size. So if I was cutting this one out, I would probably go for about the 12. So I need to find the 12. So I know I don't want this piece because it only starts at the 14. So I would find the piece I need. Some of them have, as I think we'll see in a minute with the Indie, a key that will show which lines are the sizes you need. But in this one I see it actually has the numbers next to each line. So for instance, number 6 is all these dots. Then 8 is the longer line. You've got 10 showing with a long and a slightly shorter. 12 is longer spaced out, and 14 is a solid line. So I know I need to follow this line, number 12, with my tracing paper and make sure that's the one I use for all my pieces. So while tracing out, you need to make sure that you have all the markings transferred from this, if you're tracing like myself, onto the tracing piece. The really important one would be these little triangles. Now, if you haven't seen things like these triangles before, if you're new to sewing, then these will be your notches. Notches are really important because when you've got a lot of pieces and you're trying to sew them together, the easiest way to make sure your placements are correct on your pieces is matching up the notched fabric to the pieces. And the double notches here mean that that is the back. In England, especially, I believe it is slightly different in some other countries, but certainly in England, if you have 2 notches, then that will always be the back. So you know those need to match. Other things you'll need to transfer and make sure will be things like on here, this one says fold line, and here you've got your lengthen or shorten here. Now these ones will be, again, on most patterns. If you find, for instance, that you want to lengthen a bodice or a sleeve or a trouser, you will need to make sure that you use these lines. So you'll need to have them on your pattern pieces, because if you're going to lengthen or shorten it anywhere, then this is where they recommend doing it. So always put those markings onto your pattern. Same goes with anything like this. This is your grain line. You need to make sure that's in the correct place. So when you come to cut your fabric, you're going to have your grain line matching. And so you'll have the correct lay of your fabric. You won't get any twisting or problems. Main points to remember. when you're preparing to either cut out or trace your patterns, make sure that it's ironed, make sure you have the right size pieces and you're following the right line for your size, and you're putting all the markings on. And even if they're markings that you don't understand, which believe me happened a lot in my early days, let's see if I can find an example for you. Here we go. You've got this circle here and then the size numbers next to it. And you've got these arrows and the size numbers again. Just mark them all down on your pattern piece. Things like this fold, they're all important. And if you miss any one of these off, it might become problematic when you come to sew them up. So everything you see, mark them down. Then when you've done that, the other thing I would always say if you trace, like I highly recommend if you want to reuse your pattern, is write all the information on. So obviously you want to know the pattern number, so in this case number 1, and that it's the front, and it's the front for A to E, so all styles. It's a McCall's pattern, the McCall's number, and then I write in brackets the size that I've traced. So this would be a 12 for me. So after I've put that information, I'd make sure I put the 12 in a bracket. And some people put the date that they traced it, because if you know you maybe put on a bit of weight or lost a bit of weight since that date, you may want to rethink and trace a different size. Big patterns, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see this type of paper, you're going to see these kinds of markings, and you're going to have your instructions there. So there's no need to rush and there's no need to worry. If you follow the steps as I've explained them and as they are in the pattern, and you've done everything you need to, then when you come to cut your fabric out, you'll have everything you need ready at your fingertips. So that is an example of the big 4. So let's move on to our Tilly and have a look at how indie patterns differ. Okay, so moving on to Tilly. If you're new to sewing, you may not be aware there's a really big market for the independent pattern makers, and they are very popular, and personally I have quite a lot of their patterns. One of the really well-known and popular ones in this indie pattern market is the fabulous Tilly and the Buttons. So she has the patterns like this, and also she has 3 books out, which I highly recommend. I have every single one of them, and her patterns are really a prime example of what an independent pattern designer would look like. So I thought I'd use this for the example. So as with before, we will go inside the package and show you what is inside. So the same as with your big 4, you're going to have your instructions and you're going to have your pattern pieces. Now we will go on to the pattern pieces in a second, like we did with the big 4, but I want to dive straight in to your instruction booklet. So in the instruction booklet, what I found really good, because the first patterns I did were independent mostly, is because her patterns, and the same with lots of independents, is that they do this fabulous booklet style instructions. And in the instructions, they have all the same stuff you need, but for a beginner sewer, and also for people who just like the visual, they have fantastic photo steps rather than illustrated steps. And then Tilly especially is very good for having a lot of written information on what you're expected to do at the same time as the photos. So it's really holding your hand through the step-by-step process of making your garment. So in the booklet, you'll have the same information as you would in any normal pattern, which is where they had the descriptions. Tilly, I love, calls the jargon buster. So she'll explain again things like back tacking, pivot, right side, wrong side, your ever important seam allowance, top stitch, etc. So again, she explains the same as with the other patterns in there. And then she will have your pattern size. Now, one thing that Tilly is different from some patterns is she has her own sizing, which she calls size 1 to 8. And I believe, and I should know because I have the book, but I believe she's now extending those sizes, and I think that goes up to a 10. And her sizes then have next to them the rough equivalent in a UK size. So I wouldn't necessarily stick to the size that you think you are, because ready-to-wear clothing is notoriously different from store to store, and it's the same with patterns. What you need to go for when you're choosing a pattern is the bust, waist, hip, etc., and then match the size to that. So I know, for instance, that I am roughly the equivalent of Tilly's size 5. So I will always go for a 5. And if you're unsure, don't forget you've got that finished garment measurement you can go by as well. So you choose your size, and then the same as with the other one, you will have a how to cut your fabric guide. And this is basically the same as we had in the other pattern. So they will say roughly where they think you should place it for the best result for cutting. But as I said before, depends on how much fabric you had. If you want to play a little bit of Tetris pattern moving so that you can get more out of your fabric and have more left over. But these are a really good, as we said, first step if you're not sure about placement. Tilly will also have some tips in there. So this is for a knit pattern. So she gives you some handy little tips on what you need in your to make this pattern. One of which being that you'll need a different needle specifically for sewing jersey. In which case she says a ballpoint needle. There's actually needles called jersey needles as well, which would be, you know, excellent. So again, little tips will be in her patterns. And then when you come to sew, as I say before, in the big 4 you had little illustrations and then the writing, and this one will have photographic steps and then, as I say, quite a bit of writing. I always find there's a lot more information in things like Tilly's patterns. So if you're not sure, then she really will hold your hand and it will take you right through to your finished garment, even saying the fabulous tip of give everything a final press. And so I personally really like the booklet style. For me, I find it easier to understand. I do understand that a lot of people prefer the big 4, and that's why I thought I'd show both of them, because you can sew with either. You just need to be able to read and understand the pattern. And then when you get the pattern pieces, so the main difference you're going to see from the big 4 is obviously this is on what I would call proper paper as opposed to like tissue paper. So it's a really good sturdy pattern paper. Again, I would, if you can, try and iron out those creases from where it's been before you trace or cut your pattern out. These pattern pieces in the indie patterns will always have a key as to which size you're following, and some pattern designers will do the key in a colour. So I've made a little dress for my daughter before, and oh, I can't remember the name. I will put the name in for you. But when she designed her patterns, she did them so like an orange would be a year 8, blue would be if you're 9, brown 10, etc. So you would follow the colour. But the Tilly one is more like the traditional patterns where they do slightly different lines for your size. This is really good for me because I know that I pretty much am a size 5 usually, and mine's always the little dots. So that's the one I'm going to follow. So the same as with the big 4, you will have made a note in here of which pieces you need. And it says you will need a front bodice, a back bodice and 2 sleeves. It also says you may add the following: a funnel neck, cuffs or pocket. But those 3, which is the front and back bodice and the sleeves, are the ones you definitely need. These ones don't have any different size pieces. There will only be the one piece, so you don't need to look for your size 5 and make sure it's the right piece. All the sizes are on one pattern piece. Again, find your particular one. So for me, the dotted line is number 5. So I would trace out that dotted line for number 5, remembering to put in the notches. Now the notches on Tilly and some other designer patterns, rather than being the triangular ones from the big 4, will just be a straight line. So as we said before, 2 notches. Remember, they were 2 triangles in the other one. 2 notches here means it's the back. So this one is the sleeve back, so you'd mark your notches where you need them. You've got a mark for your shoulder and your sleeve front. All these notches, as with before, you need to make sure that you mark all of them on your pattern. And then again, the same as the big four, you've still got your grain line on there that you need to mark. And then for this one, there's a 3/4 length sleeve option, and there is a full length sleeve option. So what I tend to do is I tend to trace the whole sleeve, but I will mark in the line for the 3/4 because you never know which one you're going to want to make. And then you've got the option, if you trace only the 3/4 and at a later date want to make the full length, then obviously you'd have to go back and add on that extra bit or retrace. So personally, I would just trace it all to begin with, marking any shorter length so that you can do whichever length sleeve you want in the future. And again, it's exactly the same. Apart from the quality and the look of the pattern paper, you'll want to do all the same steps. As we said, iron, trace out the pieces you need, making all the markings you need, write your information on, as we said. I tend to just literally put tilly in the buttons, Coco, sleeve, cut 2, brackets, size 5. And as we say, you've then got a really good copy of the pattern for future reference, but you've still got an intact original pattern to be cracking on with. So I know that I've only talked about actually reading the patterns, ironing the patterns, understanding them and tracing, but obviously that is the first steps towards then sitting down and getting on with actually sewing your garment. I will do that hopefully in another video, but for now, that was my little tips that I hope you find helpful on how to get your pattern out of your pattern packet and get everything you need ready and be ready to sew up your garment. Okay everyone, so that is it. I hope that you've found it helpful and that maybe it's given you a little bit of courage to get the pattern out and go through it. As I say, it's just a case of reading through it all and making sure you follow the steps like I suggested. And at the end of it, you'll have your pieces cut out and you'll be quite confident that you can sew that pattern, and I know that you can. And I'll help you by doing a little video that you can hopefully follow along with, and we'll see what fabulous garments we all make at the end. So that is it for now. I've got some other fabulous videos coming up on my YouTube channel as soon as I can. So stay tuned, stay safe, and I will see you in my next video.